I've been browsing, treading water that they drowning. My head on a swivel, yeah. It's only really my surroundings.
Hello and welcome to episode 205 of the Smash Accept podcast. I'm your host, Michael Royer. You can find me on Twitter at DynastyDadFF. And joining me, as always, is my co-host in his kitchen. Nope, actually living room. My man, Mung. How you doing tonight?
Good, man. It's been good to unwind a little bit, take a little bit of time off from the constant analysis that goes into Dynasty, redraft, DFS, and everything else week in, week out. So the playoffs are a good time to reset a little bit. I'm sure some of your guys' Dynasty leagues are a little bit more stagnant right about now, while others are still very much active. But either way, however you choose to play Dynasty, it's just fun to watch the playoff games without thinking about other implications.
Right, they just get to sit and enjoy football, even if the Bills decide to choke against the Chiefs again. You know, just sit back and enjoy it for what it is. You know, and my mind constantly is always thinking of dynasty trades, though. Like even as I'm watching games and things like that. And now we get to the off season, which is our main season, and some of the most fun topics and things that we talk about. And tonight, what I really wanted to cover is trade etiquette. The way we're able to get deals done. A lot of you guys are saying, you know what, Dad, I only made 2 trades all last year. My league mates don't listen, or, our guys aren't active enough. And the biggest question that I always get is, Mung, how do you make your league more active? Like, how do you get players involved? And you got to know your league mates, you got to know your league, but how do you encourage more trading?
Yeah, I think it starts with just activity in general, right? Whether it's off-season waivers or a little bit of trash talk. If somebody in your league is a Niners fan or a Lions fan or whatever it might be, and just keeping the discussion active, I think that helps in and of itself a lot. And 2, kind of the overall theme for tonight's show, I think, is just in general, don't be a douche. Just be nice overall. I think that's a good lesson, again, not just for dynasty leagues, but also life in general.
Turns out you're not a doucher, little Step Brothers action. But I think you're right. I mean, like, the more I do this, everyone wants to win trades, and it's like when you first start out in dynasty, that's what you want, right? People send me, and I'm sure they send it to you. Did I win this trade? And it's like some of those turn out to be your worst trades because you fleece the guy and now he doesn't want to trade with you ever again, or the rest of the league gets upset with you, and I think dynasty is more about knowing the market, your individual salesmanship, your trade etiquette, than it is about player evaluations. Like sometimes we just get wrapped up in some of those things and we forget it's 9, 10, 11, 12 other dudes in there that are just like you, and we all want to be talked to a certain way. We all want to be, engaged in a certain way. I try to find this time of year, and I think you've noticed that from me, is like sometimes I'll jump in there and make a trade early to try to stir the league back up. It might be a trade that it's a minor trade, but it gets things going. And then you start talking in the group chat. You start a little bit, like you said, that trash talking. Even if you're trading a third for Zach Moss this time of year, you're like, oh, championship, that's going to put me over the top, and you get everybody going and get everybody excited about things. The one question that I get a lot right now, and I wanted to get your opinion on that, is trade bait. Is that what are your thoughts on that? A lot of people say that's the equivalent of like Facebook, the wave, or those kind of things. Do you pay close attention? Sleeper, I love the idea of it. It isn't available on MFL, but when people update their trade bait, what are what are the pros? What are the cons? What do you like about it?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say don't be the person who puts like 80% of your team as trade bait. You don't need to blow up the chat. Trade bait is more of a tool to, like, in season, it shows people that, oh, you're putting 3 veteran superstars as trade bait. Maybe you're thinking about rebuilding, right? It speaks more to your mindset than everyone on my team is available. Like we don't need 15 straight minutes of you blowing up everybody's phone because half your team is now on the trade block.
You got to scroll down for 2 minutes just to get to the end of the red receipts, and then you can actually mark it. That I don't know why the little like red dots next to your league name are kind of like when you get emails. I can't stand that on my iPhone where it's like, oh no, I got to get that cleared.
Yeah, but in general, I think you use it as a tool, more of like a memo, right? So if you're
Yes.
saying if you put someone like Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes on the trade block, it's basically you saying, "Hey, I'm looking for the best price possible," right?
Mhm.
Or again, it's signaling what direction maybe you're looking to take your team into this offseason, whether you're going to try and push all in, right? If you start putting your picks on the trade block,
Mhm.
or whether you're putting a guy like a Stephon Diggs, a Devontae Adams, an older veteran wide receiver on the trade block saying, hey, maybe I'm thinking about retooling this offseason. So again, it's more to communicate than to be, oh, these are specifically all the players I'm looking to trade right now.
I'm so glad you said that because in my one league, guy put 21 guys, and I'm like, dude, I understand. Like we preach that, right? Like on Smash Accept, it's like there's no player who's untouchable. There's no, but yeah, like we don't need to know all 21 guys that you're interested in moving. The other turnoff for me is like when a dude will post in his trade bait that he's willing to trade. Again, Rashad Bateman right now. Oh, great. Yeah, I'm excited. Let's get involved in that one, when someone does pop up on your trade bait, talk to me a little bit about your thought process. Are you the type of guy who will send a cold offer? There's a lot more that goes into it. Some guys like to send a message of, hey man, what are you looking for this guy? Other people will send a message to him saying, I'm willing to give up X, Y, and Z. Do you want to go back and forth on this? Other people will send a cold offer. Other people will go in and they'll go in and put, instead of the other option on Sleeper is they'll hit the like button on that particular player. How do you get that conversation started in a proper mentality to try to, get yourself through a trade?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is to be direct and to have open lines of communication. And by that, I mean you want to be the one initiating the action, right? You don't want to sit back at a bar and be like, oh man, I hope this guy or this girl asks me out, right? Basically, you want to go up and say, hey, I'm interested in a polite way, but also where they know where you stand.
So no
So
pickup lines for your trades.
maybe. I mean, I haven't tried that one yet, but maybe that could be it. Yeah, I mean, in general, right? Let's say you put Christian McCaffrey on the trade block. Somebody does that, and you're looking to go all in. Generally, what I would do is one, I would send an offer because personally, it depends on the day and the time when I get a message. Sometimes I have a lot of time to look at that team and sometimes I don't. And if you catch me at a moment where I don't, then I might just decline the offer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you send your offer first, that gives them immediately something to respond to. And then along with that offer, it doesn't have to be a paragraph, right? Just a quick, hey, I'm interested in, and you look at their team, at their needs, be like, are you interested in some young wide receivers? Maybe a Rashee Rice plus for Christian McCaffrey, right? And you send, let's say, Rashee Rice plus a second, and you see what happens.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point because it's a matter of the more I've played Dynasty, my first year in, I was like one of those guys where it would be like I'd send my 4 guys for your one and be like, hey, look at the value, like this would help you out. And it's like, to me, I can't stand the pushy salesman who's trying to tell me that, player X is about to blow up, or you don't know what you're missing with player Y. If you go about it, and that's why I talk about it from a sales standpoint, or like you said, from a relationship or starting an initial conversation, you're literally going out there and saying, hey, you know what? How can I help you? And what can I give you to this that's going to be fair for you? What do you need to do to get into that area? And I think when it comes to a stud like Christian McCaffrey, the biggest advice I have for people is this past offseason or in season, I've seen so many studs traded without talking to the league at all. I've seen underselling by about a first on guys like CJ Stroud. And I'm like, whoa. Like if we knew he was available, I think you could have gotten more for that. So on the other side, when we do trade etiquette, I'm personally, if I'm selling a stud, and I have a situation right now where I'm about to enter a complete and utter rebuild in the league, and I'm going to trade CJ Stroud. I just know I am. So I'm going to put it out there, and I'm going to send a DM to everybody. I'm going to put him on the trade block, and I'm going to say, hey, just so you know, like, CJ Stroud's available if you guys want to come in. You know, if you guys want to start some initial offers and get it that way. I'm not going to announce that I'm rebuilding, because that kind of information really cuts you down a little bit. It makes it so they feel like they're going to pay 75 cents on the dollar. But sometimes I'll just say, hey, Stroud's available. You know, I'm interested in starting the conversation with you guys.
Yeah, and I will say one pet peeve that I have is I don't like when people kind of air all the offers, right? They're saying, oh, I already have this offer specifically from this GM of, 3 firsts. And that's
Well, that's
great.
a business deal, right? Because, like, if you're doing a business deal with someone, you don't want them sharing whatever the other person, what they're about to do. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost crossing a line.
It's an ethical gray area. I don't think there's anything wrong with it per se, but I would say in general, I would just say I've had a couple strong offers already. I'm probably going to accept one of these offers unless I hear from other people before the end of the week, something like that, right? Where you're letting people know that you are potentially going to move a big piece or a big player or the 101, whatever it might be. So you kind of try and generate more interest, get a few more nibbles before you make that deal. But at the same time, you're not necessarily airing out every offer, right? And especially don't bash any offers where, like, this is a terrible offer. Like, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest way to absolutely destroy communication, destroy future deals, is where you just slap it right back in their face. You'd be like, oh, that's horrible. Why would you even send that? You know, you're like, okay, this guy's taking enough time. Like, we talk about, you want to have your league active. We talk about, you want to make trades. Cause I've never spoken to someone, they're like, man, I wish my league wouldn't make so many trades. You know, like, that's not a thing. We don't talk about that. But then you're going to shoot down, oh, that was a horrible offer. Now, next time we go in there, you go into an area where I usually try to, when they say that's a horrible offer, you'd be like, well, what do you think is a little bit more fair, you know, and try to talk to them there and try to see where they're at, you know. And I think we get into an area then where you start to talk about evaluations. And this is something that I find can be triggering for some people is, oh, well, I'll send you a screenshot of Keep Trade Cut, or I'll send you a screenshot of Dynasty Trade Calculator, or somebody say, well, I don't listen to any of those. You know, it's like, well, tell me what your evaluation process is. And this is going down to your league mates, where 3 or 4 guys in every league, I know if I send something that's equivalent or better on Dynasty Trade Calculator, they're going to accept it. You know, and then there's other ones. It's like, okay, these guys are going to come up with their own evaluation, and you got to know how to deal with those individual managers themselves.
Yeah, again, it comes down to tone, right? Because I think it's fine if you want to send a screenshot, be like, oh, I thought this was close because this is how multiple sites kind of value these guys. And it's fine if you disagree, right? But don't send the message, the screenshot, and be like, look, you're dumb, you're way off by 2 firsts, right? Like, that just sends the wrong message immediately, because probably 80 to 90% of what you're saying is tone, not necessarily the words themselves. And that kind of goes along too with, like, don't try and tell other people how they should value their players or their picks, right? Perhaps you disagree a lot, right? If the guy who wants 3 seconds on top of a 2024 first to move up 1 spot in the draft, yeah, I mean, most times you're probably not going to pay that. It's probably way steep. But at the same time, if that's what they really need, then just understand that you're far apart and the deal's not going to be done. And you don't need to, yell at them and tell them that they're wrong and get into a whole debate, because that accomplishes nothing.
I like it. Now that, like I said, in the last couple of weeks, we are live on YouTube at 7 and 8 o'clock. We are live on Twitter. People are making comments as we go. Fantasy Fanatics, who's a must follow on Twitter, or X, however you want to say it, just says, keep pumping out that heat to us. Another one sent in from Matt Abramowitz. And this is an interesting one, because he said, what are we doing with Quentin Johnston? This is the time of year where, how do you go about those guys that are worth a second, those guys that are underperformed this particular season, the Marvin Mims, the Quentin Johnstons, the players that are depleting in value. They're starting to drop off. How do you approach owners in that sense? Because you don't want to over tip your hand and say, hey, I'm really coming after Quentin Johnston. How do you go about going after those guys that are starting to drop a little bit in value? And then let's talk specifically about Quentin Johnston to answer Matt's question then.
Yeah, I think you have to feel it out a little bit. Again, tone matters a lot, right? Because nobody wants Stephon Diggs on their roster right now. Let's be honest.
Mhm.
But at the same time, don't be that guy where I get a trade offer of a third for Diggs, right? And be
Mhm.
like, Stephon Diggs sucks. You might as well just give him to me. And it's like, all right, well then why do you want him, right? If
Mhm.
he's so bad. And I think it's a fine line because on the one hand, if you are trying to buy low on a player, you do want to kind of bring up whatever's been disappointing about them, right? But at the same time, you don't want to be like he's worthless because then again, why are you trying to trade for him? So
Mhm.
in general, I would say basically I would open with the line after you send the offer, let's say a late second or a 2025 second for Quentin Johnson, if you still believe him, right? Be like, hey, I don't know if you still believe in Johnson, but I think maybe he can still be good. So just wanted to see where you're at with him. Something along those lines. Again, send an offer before you send that message, right?
Mhm.
Again, drive that action. But I think it's a good way. Again, you don't want to bash a player or really talk him down before you send an offer because again, the tone isn't quite right with that.
So, and one thing that we've always hit on is insulated trades. And I think Quentin Johnston, if you believe in him, and you said Stephon Diggs on the other side, would you rather have a 25 first random and Quentin Johnston or Stephon Diggs and a late 24 or late 25 second? So a 1-2 flop with Johnston and Diggs.
Um, probably take yeah. I honestly would probably just take the first because that's the best piece to me. I don't care so much about Johnston.
Yeah, I think that's an area where I mean we talk about he's not one of the guys that we're saying is an insulated type player, but at the same time, he's asking what to do with Quentin Johnston. And my biggest problem is when people like they paid a 107, 108, and they're selling him already for a 24 second. And it's like that's probably not the best avenue to go about it. Package him with somebody, wait until the offseason, see what happens a little bit, and try to move from there. Um, as far as trade etiquette, what are some of those like pet peeves to you that just make it so it's much more difficult to trade? Something that we spoke to a few, but something else there that's just like, you know what, this is not going to get it done.
Yeah, well, going back to Johnson real quick, I will say I'm not really looking to go out and buy him.
Mm-hmm.
If you drafted him in the first round, I guess you're kind of just stuck with him. I would probably take a second, but I was never super high on Johnson to begin with. If it costs a third to get him, that's
Mm-hmm.
cheap enough where I'd roll the dice. Um, but yeah, going back to tone, I think it's just important to realize that arguing isn't going to necessarily change someone's mind about how they value a player,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sometimes it's better just to walk away and find a player that you do agree on valuation wise, right? Kind of shift the trade talks, even if the trade bait was activated, say for a Stephon Diggs, maybe then, oh, what about like Jacoby Myers or someone else, another veteran wide receiver? Maybe you're closer on that value on that person's roster
Mm-hmm.
versus just kind of trying to hammer it home when you clearly don't agree on a certain player's value. And that kind of goes back to just communicating, right? Being, um, you don't always have to be nice, but just be direct, I guess
Mm-hmm.
is the best way. And again, understanding that not every trade offer is going to work out. Even if you talk back and forth, I get constant questions on Twitter here and there where it's the 15th variation of a deal and I say, well, just send this and be like, this is the offer. It's
Yes.
okay if it
Yes.
doesn't work out. And maybe we're just too far apart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not all deals are meant to get done.
People don't know when to walk away. It's like there's that. You and I have had several in Smash except one where and I've realized that the cold offer, you're better with that one-on-one kind of direction of like, how do you want to do this? Who do you like here? What do you want to do? But I think sometimes you and I were trying to do a Pittman and Waddle deal. You know what I mean? And I think we went back and forth a couple times. It's like, okay, this wasn't it. This didn't work for us. There's no need to kind of push there. But sometimes people will say, well, dad says we should have been buying Jordan Love. So I'm going to go until the guy says, all right, we're good. Like you don't want to overpay on it. You should be able to, like, if you're buying a used car, you're trying to get X, Y, and Z thrown in. You're trying to get the price down a little bit. You got to know when it's a value and when you can walk away. There's certain times where it's just like, okay, you're not willing to add that second like I'm asking for. Would you add a third? They say no. You're like, okay, well, I think I'm good, and then there's no problem coming back and saying, sometimes when we do that back and forth 5-6 times, I'll say, you know what, this is my final offer. This is all I can do. Do not send another counter. Like, this is the farthest I'm willing to go, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's clear expectations and communication.
Yeah. And I think a really good lesson that I've learned both in Dynasty and in life is just don't take things personally, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay if a deal doesn't get done. It's okay if you get rejected for a date. It's okay if you don't get hired for a job, right? Just go move on to the next. Again, if you're sending a trade offer for the 103, you really like a player that you might get there, they might fall to the 104, right? Keep that avenue open, right? Look into the 104, the 105, the 102, even if you think that's going to be a little too expensive. You don't have to get too stuck on one trade. And also, just real quick, this applies to discourse about dynasty players and rookie players in general, because we're getting to rookie season. You can disagree on rookie prospects. We're all going to be right. We're all going to be wrong on certain prospects. Debate them. Talk about, who you believe in, who you don't. But at the end of the day, don't take it personally if you're debating a player and they don't think that player is good and you do, right? That's fine. Just leave it at that. You don't need to resort to name calling. Be like, oh, this is dumb. Start pulling up Twitter receipts, right? I see so many of those negative interactions on Twitter sometimes, and it's like, just let it go, right?
Yeah.
Like, in your heart, like, oh, I'm going to be right about this player. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're not, but don't drag everything down into an endless debate.
Yeah, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I can't tell you how many people told me that I was stupid for having CJ Stroud over Bryce Young. And I was like, okay, all right, that panned out. Then there's on the flip side, I had a guy the other day send me a tweet from when Puka Nacua had his first game, say, hey, I'm selling for any first. It wasn't the wrong process, right? The results didn't work out, but sometimes the process year after year after year of trusting that a guy drafted in that round is not going to pan out after a big game is something that you hit 9 times out of 10, and you're going to miss that one, and that's where we talk a lot about process over results. This was the right call. It just didn't pan out. And that's okay to understand that, I think in a redraft mentality, you're like, oh, you missed it. But in a dynasty mentality, okay, it didn't work out on this one, but now I can trade for the next one, or I can win the next draft pick and make sure I go into that area. Because sometimes people get caught up on that, and then they try to do whatever they can to get that player off their roster then. You know what I mean? Like, I have people telling me they traded Bryce Young for the 208. And I'm like, why would you do that? You drafted him at 102. They're like, well, I just want him off my roster because it's a reminder that I didn't take CJ Stroud. And I'm like, would you do that with real money? Like, we talk about stocks and assets. Would you just be like, you know what? I don't like that anymore. Just get it out of here. I don't want to see it anymore. Like, go through the process. You're going to be right. You're going to be wrong. And I think I have a bunch of trades here from the Patreon that I'd like to get your input on. And then as we're doing it, let's talk a little bit about trade etiquette, maybe something that we see or different angles that we go in. The first one sent in from Inept Guru. He said, this trade here, the one side gets the 108. The other side gets Austin Eckler, Nick Chubb, and the 310 in a super flex league.
I would take the 108. I am hopeful for Chubb, but I think he's just a throw-in into that deal at this point. And I do lean the 108 over Eckler, given the decline that we saw and just concerns about the Chargers in general, right? We don't know what the receiving core is going to look like going forward. They got a lot of players who are either getting up there in age or getting banged up a lot. And then also we have no idea what the coaching is going to look like just yet. So a lot of unknowns. And in general, I would take the first over what is Eckler, 29 next year-old running back? Something like that?
I think he'll be actually 30. But I think, in this scenario, I'm buying Eckler and Chubb cheap. I've been buying them for the 209 to 212, which I just updated. I know you did your dynasty rankings. I just updated mine in the Patreon, and I have them both valued.
I mean, there's a big difference between the 209 and the 108.
But the 209 and the 210 is not worth the 108. And this is an absolute smash accept. I think he won that trade big time, and I think that's the kind of move. Don't go and parade that around then. That's one where I see sometimes people drop a bunch of gifts and talk about how bad they fleeced somebody in their own league. And I'm like, you just went and you canceled out that trade. You won that trade. That's great. Let everybody else talk. And if they start talking trash, don't join in there as well. Sometimes I see that you always get the Blink 182 WTF or the blinky eyes one when you get a trade. What does that say to you when, let's say I make a trade with you, and now all of a sudden somebody else from the league is mocking you based off that trade?
Yeah, I generally try not to have those reactions. I will say
you might have them in your own head.
Well, a couple times I will reply with the emoji with the eyes, because if it's like something real far off, I'm like, oh, that's but I'm not going to go out and I won't type out like, wow, what a terrible trade, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. Again, you're just burning bridges, right? And then two, if you're joining in on that, that's real bad karma, right? That's how you get Eckler blowing up for 2,000 yards next year. Because remember, nothing is guaranteed, right? People, like you said, they were super happy. I'm sure some people sold Puka for 2 firsts and thought they fleeced someone, right? And perhaps now that offer wouldn't get Puka. So again, it's just keeping in mind that there are vast ranges of outcomes. And just because we think we know what's going to happen doesn't mean that that's going to happen.
Yeah, you think you win a trade, and then it's, in Smash Except 3, where I had all 12 first-round picks. I don't even want to tell you this, Mung, but the only one I traded was C.J. Stroud for Chris Olave. And I was like, yeah, got the whole class. Like it sucks, but, you go through it and you move on. Next one sent in from Mendeleev in the Discord. It's a super flex 0.5 PPR, but then another 0.5 for a first down. And we're looking at Dalton Schultz, Terry McLaurin, and what is a mid 25 first, or Tyler Lockett and TJ Hawkinson. His context is he already has McBride and Waller at tight end. And right now he thinks the 25 first is mid, but could be all the way to top 3. And that's a tough thing to predict this time of year, because you and I have talked about that a lot. Like, predicting 25 firsts is not always easy.
Yeah, so much is going to happen between now and next offseason, right? We're talking a year plus.
They could have drafted Puka. They could have drafted Sam Laporta in the second. They could have traded Patrick Mahomes for 4 firsts, and they all hit.
Yeah, I will say I would lean the package, though. I would probably be selling Hawkinson for that. I think volume has been there for him, but we don't even know if he's going to be ready by week 1, right? Given the timing of his injury. 2, Jordan Addison was coming on a little bit. So depending on what happens there, maybe the targets are split up a little bit more behind Jefferson. And then also I think Schultz and McLaurin are decent buy lows. I've never been on the McLaurin elite wide receiver 1 train. I think he's a little bit overhyped. I think he's a solid wide receiver, but certainly not, a true number 1. But at the same time, I think 2023 was so bad for him. And for whatever reason, Howell just never looked his way.
But Brissett peppered him.
Right. And I think there's still upside for both Schultz, given what we've seen from Stroud, and whether it's Howell or a different offensive scheme, there's still paths to upside based on what we saw in 2023 with McLaurin.
Yeah, latest mock has them taking Jaden Daniels, and you got to talk about new quarterback coming or new coach coming in, so a lot can change. I like it. Next one's a rebuilding trade: Cole Kmet and the 311 or the Superflex 201.
I like Kmet, and I think if you look at his points per game, it's pretty good because he had some blow up games. But in general, I would see that almost as, did you say Superflex?
Superflex, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost like a first, given the quarterbacks that are going to squeeze into the first round. I would lean the 201 there.
Good, because that was my trade. So the way I was looking at it is, for me, Cole Kmet, you could say, is worth an early second, but I'm rebuilding. And if I'm rebuilding, Cole Kmet's not a centerpiece. Where there is a non-zero chance that with J.J. McCarthy potentially going in the first round, we're looking at 4 quarterbacks. there could be an area where, I've been seeing Adonai Mitchell fall into the second round, and he went in Kuiper's latest mock, went first round to the Bills. So there's a scenario where you get the running back 1 out of this class at 2-1, or the lottery tickets that you want in a rebuild. A Cole Kmet is never one where you're like, I got it, right? But you could have gotten Sam Laporta at 201 last year. So you make that kind of move and you take that upside lottery ticket where if you fail, you lost a guy who's worth a second. At worst, you're just kind of moving laterally, but I'm always trying to build in and get those better shots, when you're talking about rebuild. He's a fine asset. At the 201, you could buy other tight ends where they're going to be in that scenario where you're getting more production. Even though
and it also goes back to the timing and seasonality of value, right? That we talk about a lot in Dynasty, where we know these rookie picks are going to appreciate in value over the coming months, right? Mm-hmm. There are going to be guys that people love, prospects who are coming out who maybe aren't super exciting right now, but once they go to a certain landing spot, or once one highlight tweet just skyrockets their value for whatever reason, we know that the 201 could potentially gain a ton of value, especially when it's on the clock. And the same thing isn't going to be possible for Cole Kmet.
Mm-hmm. Another trade incentive from R. Lucas. He packaged the 210 and the 310 for Evan Ingram. And this is the time where we talk about buying seconds, and just recorded a pod with Snoog where it's like, there are, like I said, from Kuiper's mock, 12 guys going in the first round as far as wide receivers and quarterbacks. That means running backs are going to push things back. So we're saying to buy seconds, but late second and a late third for a guy that finished as a top 5 tight end. As much as I know you're not huge on Ingram, to me, this is a smash accept.
Yeah, I think he's a fine, reliable back-end tight end 1 who gets volume, right? And like you said, 210's a crapshoot, so I'm fine with that deal.
One of my favorite guys to play in leagues. He just took over one of the orphans. He's in Smash Accept 10 with you, which I believe he has almost all the first-round picks. Codester. In here, he's Scarface 843. Side 1, it's Codester 843. Devonta Smith in the 211, or Debo 206 and 306.
I would lean Debo. I think we've seen really good flashes from Devontae, but I know people read into AJ Brown clearing his Instagram or whatever, but I think as long as he's still there on the Eagles next year, it's just tough to see a path to consistent target volume or production for Smith. And Debo, for as fragile as he has been here and there, right, banged up with the shoulder issue, he's had a lot of hamstring stuff over the years, but we know when he's on the field, he's a top 12 wide receiver.
I'm on the Devonta side by a little bit, just the age and the production's been fantastic. Debo had an amazing season there. So I could see that if you're win now, Debo in the 206, and maybe you get a better running back. If you're rebuilding, Devonta might be a little bit longer, but that's not a smash one way or another, but it's a good trade.
Yeah, it's close overall.
Next one, and this one somehow, I don't even know. This is don't do this, but T-Pick5 said that he traded Michael Thomas, Khalil Herbert, Josh Downs, and Noah Gray for the Superflex 105. Let's not get caught up in any traps here where you trade 4 nickels for $1. I would never do that, but this is an area where if this trade happens, just try to avoid the group chat. That's one where people are going to start getting a little fired up.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not good, but at the same time, right, you never know. Travis Kelce, if he gets married to Taylor Swift this season or this offseason, and then Noah Gray suddenly becomes a superstar, crazier things have happened. So again, yeah, clearly very cheap for the 105, but you never know.
Here's a fun one. I sent in from Reckless: Lamar Jackson and A.J. Brown, or Patrick Mahomes and Trey McBride in Superflex tight end premium.
Whew. This is
that's a good one.
That's a blockbuster.
Snoog was mad at me, and Twitter blew up that I moved Lamar Jackson into tier 1. I'm with you now. I have him right there, right underneath Mahomes. I have him as my QB4. I feel like it's a tier up there with the way he played this season. So it's a matter of if you have Lamar and Patrick in the same tier, how close are Trey McBride and AJ Brown? Right now in startups, I believe Trey McBride's going mid-third and AJ Brown's going late second. So how much do you value Patrick Mahomes over Lamar Jackson, and how close is that for you?
Yeah, I mean, in Superflex, I have Lamar 2 overall and Mahomes 3 overall, so
Mhm.
they're pretty close for me. Um, tight end premium, I think this is pretty close between McBride and AJ Brown, but
Mhm.
I'm not quite as high on McBride as the consensus. I feel like I have McBride a tier below Laporta and Kincaid. I know some people who have him higher or in that same tier.
Yeah.
So for me, even though AJ Brown faded a little bit down the stretch, the Eagles offense had a ton of issues. I think he's still an elite, league winning top 3 wide receiver when he's healthy, when everything's clicking with the Eagles offense. So I'm still taking Lamar and AJ Brown here.
I'm having a hard time not. I mean, I have McBride as my tight end too, but it's like, man, that's a juicy trade. I like that one a lot. And again, if you're making this kind of trade, if you're trading Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson, put it out there. Don't just don't take the first trade that's out there, because you never know. You could offer this out there and say, hey, I'm shopping Patrick Mahomes, and then the next thing you know, instead of the guy that's offering Lamar and AJ Brown, the next guy comes in with Anthony Richardson, 2 firsts, and Nico Collins, or like somebody just really ramps that trade up, and you never know until you put it out there. You got to tell people what they're willing to go out there and trade. So next one sent in from Dieseldorf. This is it says 25-second, which he says is going to be late, and Michael Pittman or Devonta Smith.
Yeah, I think Smith and Pittman are close enough that I would take the second.
I am too, and he got that one there, so we're on the same page there. Just trying to grab a couple of them here. Stephen Blanda has a question, and we love when you guys are watching the live stream. Like I said, Tuesday night, 7 or 8 o'clock. Stephen Blanda says, would you trade David Njoku for Chuba and Pat Fryermuth in Superflex PPR Dynasty with no tight end premium?
I would not. I would take Njoku. I think Hubbard played
too.
well for what he is this year, right? Obviously better than Miles Sanders, who I don't think anybody thought it was a good deal when Carolina signed him to a bunch of money last offseason. But I think Hubbard is a replaceable talent. I think he'll be in a committee, whether in Carolina or elsewhere. And I think Freiermuth is a good tight end.
Yes.
A lot of issues in Pittsburgh not having to do with his talent has factored into why he hasn't produced. But at the same time, again, I think Freiermuth's more of a possession, tight end, whereas we don't know with Cleveland whether it's Joe Flacco, Deshaun Watson, whether Deshaun Watson's going to be good or bad next year. But we know the ceiling is super high with Njoku, and I would rather have that high upside piece at the end of the day.
Yeah, final 8 weeks of the season, he was tight end 2 or 3, right in that area. He's one of my biggest buys. I have him as my dynasty tight end 10, and I have Pat Fryermuth as my dynasty tight end 15. He's not that far off from being in that same area, but Chuba Hubbard, as much as I love Chuba, and I was saying to buy him in season because he was so cheap, now you get to an area where he is a replaceable level running back, and it's why this time of season, Steven, where I say I'm not really investing a lot in running backs outside the top 12 or 13, or getting a Alvin Kamara and Aaron Jones, a Joe Mixon, a guy that's cheap right now who's not going to see much competition. I do think there's a scenario where Carolina definitely drafts a running back with just him and Miles Sanders there. So I don't think he's going to be getting those 20 carries a game like he had down the stretch that made him fantasy viable. So
yeah, Chuba, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary. I mean, you could name 30 running backs who are all kind of in the same tier in the offseason, where they're all good. They're all going to produce for you at some point next year, probably. But, it's way too early in the offseason to try and predict starting roles and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. We got one here sent in from my man Bear Down 34, Matthew Stafford or Kadarius Toney in the 209. Now, when you add Kadarius Toney onto a side, sometimes it actually detracts the value. They're like, just keep it. Matthew Stafford, I think, is one of my biggest buys. How do you go about dealing with those type of players? The guys that almost like in a trade, no one wants to touch, the Kadarius Toney types. And, there's always those guys where it's like, okay, I don't want anything to deal with him. How do you go about that in these kind of deals?
Yeah, well, one, if this is super flex, I would have Stafford closer to the 109 than the 209. So I agree that I think he's a big buy low this
Yeah.
offseason. We've seen that he can still be a top 12 fantasy
Yeah.
quarterback with ease
Surprisingly,
if he's healthy, right?
KTC has him right now, which is QB 22, which is the equivalent of a 26 first or early 24 second. So I think he's just still a screaming buy. Like people look at that, he's going to be 36 years old, but I mean, he just was slinging it this year. As long as he's playing, Puka's there. I think Cup's there. I think Stafford's a great buy, and just nobody wants veterans this time of year. So that's the tricky part. But I want to talk real quick about veterans because now that we brought that up, I mean, every year in startups, they become the value. You look at things like a guy like Matthew Stafford, we talked about Stephon Diggs, we talked about Austin Eckler. How do you go about doing that? Because that's one of my biggest questions is people are like, Dad, I'm trying to get rid of Austin Eckler. I'm trying to get rid of Derrick Henry. I'm trying to get rid of Stephon Diggs. And we're a society where it's like we want to do things immediately, but I'm like, just be patient. Like you can't get proper value for Derrick Henry right now. You can't get proper value for Devontae Adams right now. So like, how do you go about trying to tell people to be patient in that sense? Because it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's like betting the Cardinals plus 6.5 against the Eagles, right? When they upset them. And sometimes you have to understand that the uncomfortable thing can be the right thing. And whether it's buying a guy like Stephon Diggs right now, right? Nobody wants him. But given his range of outcomes, right? What if he was just a little bit banged up?
I'm buying
What
it.
if he and Josh Allen really click again next year?
Mhm.
And even if he's only good for 3 or 4 games, that opens up a window for you to buy low right now and then sell high come August or September, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in the fantasy championship game next year with Stephon Diggs, and he has to have a completely amazing season. So it's just the price point, right? And trying to separate the name of a player with their actual projected stats or projected role for 2024.
I'm buying Stephon Diggs. I saw him on Twitter go for the 205 and 209. I'm willing to pay a late 25 first for a couple reasons. Stephon Diggs disappears in December and January every year. You look at 2019, he's had with the Bills outside of 2020, where he had a couple games here and there, 23 games in 2019, 2021, 2020, 2023, 23 games in December and January, and he's had over 100 yards twice. For some reason, something just clicks there. The games in November, September to November, he's a wide receiver one every single year. So if you buy low now because somebody's ticked off that he didn't show up and he balls out in September, October, you just instantly flip it over there. But it's tough. I just tell people to be patient, just like our guy here, Timothy Ligon. Hopefully I pronounced that right. He said, does Calvin Ridley have any value left? Not a bad season considering things. This is the time to buy those kind of guys if you believe in, like I was just saying with Diggs, if you believe that, like I do, that Austin Eckler was banged up and he's going to be a value going into the season. If you believe that Nick Chubb is a guy that's, once he gets recovered, he's going to tear it up. I mean, is Calvin Ridley someone I've always been on the Kirk side? Calvin Ridley's a free agent. He could go somewhere else. I've heard obviously rumblings of Kansas City and things like that. I mean, I think he's a low-key buy because of the uncertainty of potentially moving on or staying in the same situation at minimum.
Yeah, I would say in general, again, it all comes down to price point, right? Am I paying a first for Calvin Ridley? Definitely not.
No.
But if you can get him for mid-second or less, like you said, I think being in Jacksonville, we all thought that getting Trevor Lawrence was going to be good for his fantasy value, but Lawrence just never really looked his way. And I think actually getting away from the Jaguars might be a good thing for him this offseason. Like you said, obviously a place like Kansas City would be a dream landing spot, but even elsewhere where he has opportunity to truly just be that go-to guy for whatever quarterback, right? So again, I think the talent is still somewhat there. I'm hesitant to pay a ton for a soon-to-be 30-year-old wide receiver, but if you can get him for a 206, anything less than that, that's probably still pretty decent considering, again, the range of outcomes, right?
I love it. I just did my rankings. He's wide receiver 45 in the 206 to 208 range, or
There you
205
go.
to
We're
208.
aligned
So
there.
right in line. I think that's a decent buy. Question sent in from Hammer Dynasty. Would you trade AJ Brown for Jordan Addison in the 110 in a 10-team super flex? Now, I personally have moved AJ Brown. You're going to hate me. This is including rookies as my wide receiver 8. And I have Jordan Addison as my wide receiver 20. The 110, I don't think closes the gap for me, though. I think the 107, if I had a chance to get Rome Odunze, or the 106, I would smash it. The 110 doesn't quite do it for me unless you're rebuilding.
Hey, AJ Brown, wide receiver 8 for me too.
No, we're lining up.
Yeah, we are very much aligned for right now for this podcast at least. And I like Addison. He showed well. I have him worth a mid first, so not too far off.
Yeah,
I think it's close in value overall, but especially in a shallower 10-team league too, I want those potentially elite assets, right? And again, as long as Justin Jefferson's on the field, in most games, Jordan Addison isn't going to see double-digit targets, right? Whereas AJ Brown, we've seen, even though again the Eagles and he both kind of trailed off over the second half of the year, AJ Brown can be a league winner, and I don't see that necessarily for Addison. So again, agreed with you. I would need a little bit more than the 110.
Yeah, I think if I'm rebuilding, if you add a mid 25 second, I'd consider it. If you're contending and you get a running back like Alvin Kamara, or maybe something, or an Aaron Jones added in there, so now it's like, but I'm with you. Like in 10 team, you want those studs, and Jordan Addison, unfortunately, it falls more in the wide receiver 2 to early wide receiver 3 category than AJ Brown, who's a clear cut wide receiver 1. So
yeah, if you're rebuilding, I would consider countering with like AJ Brown and a 25 second for Addison 110 and a 25 first, something along those lines, right? Always try to get another first. And then also just timing the market, right? It's a terrible time to trade AJ Brown. He got hurt. He missed their playoff game. He had a couple down weeks even before that. So his stock's depressed right now. And it's a good time to just hold some of these players like a Diggs or an AJ Brown, who kind of ended the year on a cold streak rather than sell low.
So you just did your dynasty rankings. I just did mine. And I want to talk about some, I mean, we're going to do this all off season, but a couple key takeaways that I had that I'm not sure where you're at. But for me, it's like quarterback is really nice up until 17 again. And then it's completely up in the air. And, like I'm feeling like wide receivers the same way. It's like I'm finding huge value gaps of like from 1 to 18 at most positions, and then just a huge tier of guys that are worth mid seconds. Like I think there are 8 or 12 running backs that I would pay a first for, and there's 18 wide receivers, and I feel like it's like the disappearing middle class. The seconds just keep getting bigger and bigger this time of year, where guys that I'm willing to pay a first keep shrinking, and that's something dynasty wise that I'm really starting to just be like, okay, you know what? This is that off season. I don't want to give up that first, because that late first could be the next Justin Herbert. That late first could be, Sam Laporta, like it was. You know what I mean? Like this is that time where I just keep saying more guys are worth an early second than I am saying I'm willing to pay a first.
Yeah, and again, I think there's going to be a perceived gap in value between a late first and early second. But if you're trading away those early seconds, remember a lot of those guys can get pushed down to you at 201 or 202. Particularly in Superflex, right? So I almost try and treat those, at least as a bargaining chip, as almost a late first, right? I'll even say that in trade negotiations sometimes, where I have the 201, I'll be like, this is basically a late first, right? How many guys like an Achan or Laporta were available at 201 in some leagues because they dropped?
Yeah, and that happens every single year. So that's always good. I'm just excited. Super Bowl's right around the corner. I'm starting to line up guests for, right after we get through that. I mean, and I think this is going to be a fun off season. I think it's going to be one that's beneficial. And every year, just keep getting sharper with what we talk about, and try to push you guys to the next move. What's next coming for you down the pipeline for Fantrax or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be updating my dynasty rankings again once free agency starts. I still tinker with them even now, here and there. Again, during the playoffs, I think it's time to take a little break, just enjoy watching some of the games. But also, like you said, right, dynasty values are still shifting because everyone is watching these games. That means a really good play or really bad play can immediately change a player's value. And I think two guys to kind of watch out for that I would look to sell high right now. One, Khalil Shakir. I'm seeing him garner a little hype. I think he's a good player, a good complimentary guy, but he's not all that different from a Cole Beasley, something like that, where the Bills just needed someone to step up with Diggs dropping balls, and then with Gabe Davis hurt,
They're going to draft somebody too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we have to remember that the roster that you just saw in the last game isn't the one that's going to be starting for them week 1, right? So
good point.
I like Shakir. I'd buy him for a third. I don't know that I'd pay a whole lot more than that. And then 2, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with this one. I would look to sell high on Rashee Rice. I think there's a lot of hype on the Chiefs right now, and deservedly so for how well they've been playing and how they've turned that offense around a little bit. But you also have to remember they played a Miami defense that was down like 4 or 5 starters due to injury. Same thing with the Bills defense, right? Tons of injuries for both of those defenses, where it did help make the Chiefs look a little bit better than they actually were on offense. And then 2, Rashee Rice is great yards after the catch guy. He's shown some great hands and route running skills here and there. I don't know that he's a true number 1. I think he was more thrust into that number 1 role because all they had was Stone Hands Tony, MVS, who drops everything, almost by default, right? They had to make him a focal point of the offense. And I like the Bills, I think Rice is still going to be heavily involved next year, especially if Kelsey takes another step back. But at the same time, I don't think that he's going to be that true number 1 heir apparent to Tyreek Hill in Kansas City either. And I think some do perceive him that way.
And I think I'm with you because for me, there's guys that are buys, right? And we put that out there. And for me, guys like Jordan Love, guys like Rashee Rice were buys. Now they're priced over accordingly, right? Like Rashee Rice 2 months ago was worth the 112. Now I seen him traded the other day for the 104. Now you're talking about a guy like Malik Neighbors who has a top 10 type upside, which Rashee Rice does not. I have him as wide receiver 16. Jordan Love, I saw the other day traded for the 103 plus a 25 first. So now you're saying a guy like Drake May plus a first on top of that. Like you get to an area, right, where a guy goes from a buy to a hold to a sell. And that's what we really try to do on this podcast is put you guys into those situations. So thanks again for tuning in, guys, and enjoy the process.